Okay, good evening, and sorry about the wait. Welcome to the Saturday Talk. Tonight we have Amy Chan. She's going to be talking about our stories in ivory. Thank you.
Thanks, Nak. Anakaloa tak, atiga Amy Chan, asi atiga Inupak Okpik, Arlington, Virginia mi, Nuniak Tunya. Saviagniak Fellow, Smithsonian Arctic Studies Center. Asi Aglagiagniak Tunya, Arizona State University. So good evening, I'm Amy Chan, as Knox said, and I'm currently a fellow at the Smithsonian Arctic Studies Center, and also I am pursuing my dissertation at Arizona State University. So thanks so much for having me this evening. And so during this kind of short presentation, I'm going to discuss the use of engraved ivory drill bows as a type of visual story aid, briefly reviewing the emergence and diffusion of pictorial engraving, the drill bow construction and use, oral narratives surrounding the bows, and the potential for these engraved drill bows to foster communication between communities, scholars, and museums. This presentation ties into my larger dissertation research on ivory drill bows and considers questions such as, do engravings relate to specific oral narratives of hunting and myth time stories? What can scenes tell us about traditional whaling, hunting, and ceremonial practices? How did external influences such as Russians and European whalers affect the content and different styles of the engravings? How were objects such as drill bows acquired as representations of Eskimo culture? And can pictorial engravings function as links between the past and the present, kind of invigorating cultural traditions and stories? To kind of help understand and answer these questions, my work involves collections and archival research from several museums, including the Smithsonian, American Museum of Natural History in New York, the University of Alaska Museum of the North in Fairbanks, also other museums in Alaska such as the Alaska State Museum and the Sheldon Jackson Museum. In addition, the project involves working with carvers and communities in many different areas in North Alaska. And so I'm working with them as they're sharing their knowledge of hunting and carving experiences. This kind of overall project is based on understanding that oral narratives and stories can bring life and meaning to objects that are now within museums. These are just a couple of photos showing drill bows being used. The top one from Point Hope, you can see him outside carving. The bottom one, I think, is from Nome, and you can see also it's oftentimes a group setting, so it's a very collaborative type project with lots of things going on. So 19th century carvers shared a catalog of visual imagery, which includes Umiat pursuing Ogvik and bowhead whales and Ivik walrus, hunters tracking tutu, caribou, and ugrik, bearded seal, village activities such as hanging up ikulugrok, salmon, and picking different types of asiat, berries. You'll also see scenes of warfare, festivals, mythological events, and Euro-American interactions. The engravings on the bows carry some really valuable cultural information, as noted by Herbert Nugazuk of Wales, who says that the stories of our ancient past are very complex. Stories are immeasurable wealth to any people. You can actually see the faces and hear the voices of a person you are learning about, or the voice of a walrus as stories are being related about them. As shown on these two photographs in the top and on this drill bow collected from Norton Sound at the bottom, until the mid-20th century, the kugri, or men's house, served as a central carving and storytelling location. Edward Nelson, who was an ethnographer and collector all over North Alaska and the Yukon-Kuskokwim, wrote in during the 1880s, men are nearly always to be found in the Kashim, when in the village, this being their general gathering place where they work on tools or implements of the chase or in preparing skins. Quote. Sitting with legs outstretched, carvers could chat and relay stories while undertaking this really painstakingly slow task of carving really minute scenes on the ivory surfaces. Carvers in training, such as these young boys up at the top left, had the opportunity to observe tools and techniques being used as sounds of splitting and scratching punctuated these stories of ancient creatures and hunting exploits. As seen in this recent clip from the Heritage Center's traditional room, many carvers, such as John Heffel, continue to work in an environment that is full of sounds from voices and tools. As seen on this two-sided drill bow acquired by Samuel Spriggs in Barrow around 1900, Kugri also functioned as ceremonial centers for feasts and dancing. And the detail, which is here in the middle, you can see a group of figures beating stretched drums, probably of stretched walrus stomach, and a number of dancing figures wearing loon or raven headdresses. Sylvester Ayek describes the King Island raven dance that was given to an ice fisherman and incorporates Unabkak, or stories from a time far removed from the present. Engraved ivory images such as these powerfully illustrate these stories of history and legend and mediate between ancient and contemporary practices. So just a little bit about where does pictorial engraving come from. It derives primarily from the Bering Strait area, a region which encompasses North and Northwest Alaska, all the way at the top, it's the limits of it, St. Lawrence Island, there in the middle, and areas of the Chukchi Peninsula. Cultural values and traditions continue to be respected and encouraged, such as community participation in whaling, honoring elders, and learning the Inupiaq language, also passing on oral stories, dancing, and carving on bone and ivory. And at the bottom here we have Art Amatuk from Point Hope, and he is participating in the Gifts from the Ancestors exhibit, which was held a couple years ago at the Princeton Art Museum. The emergence or the beginning of the Bering Strait pictorial style remains contested among archaeologists and other scholars. Along the coast, early pictorial engravings are found on a small number of handles, combs, wrist guards, and other functional items. Carvings, these early carvings often feature solitary animals and figures, such as this knife handle, which is on the top, and it's made out of a small mammal jawbone, which is engraved with 3 whales' tails, collected in 1912 by Wilhelmer Stephenson at Cape Smythe. Many early engravings also feature parallel lines and lines with triangular tooth-shaped ticking. As seen as on this wrist guard here, it's a little dark. This was acquired from the Cape of Whales area. Ivory engraving styluses, which is on the bottom left here, have also been found in kind of these ancient archaeological sites, such as Ipiutak and Point Hope. And these would often, sometimes these are found with microflints in them or ground squirrel teeth. And the ground squirrel teeth, when I've spoken with carvers, they're suggesting those were used to carve on wood, and the microflints would have been used to carve on ivory. While some of those early engravings and ivories that we just looked at feature real simple motifs, by the 18th century, pictorial engraving had developed into a really complex style consisting of multiple figures and animals and appearing on a range of tools and household articles. At the top we have a net gauge that's engraved with tutu, and then this has been referred to as a top, but could have also been used as a sinew spinner, perhaps. Both of those are from Port Clarence, and then this is one of the earlier ivory drill bows that was acquired in the Norton Sound area. So just showing the range of types of objects where this engraving style appears. Drill bows, such as this one, acquired in Norton Sound around 1890, appear to have been the favored surface on which to engrave all these scenes. There are over 400 ivory bows now in European and American museums. This one is interesting. It has a combination of an old and new style of engraving that's found in the Nome and King Island area, which is it serves as a transitional object. At the top left, you have a carver in his tent, perhaps in a summer tent, although he has on a warm fur parkie, and he is using a drill bow to carve on a large tugat, ivory tusk, possibly a cribbage board. Engraved drill bows visibly entered the non-native world in the late 18th century with the 1778 exploration of Captain James Cook. In 1784, James Pinnett illustrated a drill bow collected by Cook, which included engraved animals and figures quite similar to those found on later bows. So this is one of the earliest illustrations of a drill bow that exists. Close to 50 years later, Captain F.W. Beechey writes of drill bows. He says, quote, "On these instruments were etched a variety of men, beasts, and birds, with a truth and character which showed the art to be common among them. By comparing one with another, a little history was obtained, which gave us better insight into their habits than could be elicited from any signs or imitations." Unquote. Drill bows formed part of a carver's toolkit, which also included an adze, which is sometimes called a cayune or a ulamon, a flint flaker, a knife, which pixioon, and a scraper stored together in a wooden toolbox, which we have an example down here at the bottom, or a caribou hide satchel. And these would be taken with their carvers if they were going to the kungri to carve, or if they were caribou hide satchel, perhaps if they were going out to fish camp or out on the ice. Made from split walrus ivory or caribou antler, a drill bow, Petixiak down south, or some up here in Barrow, we often say Niuktun, is typically strung with a strip of seal hide, ugruk, for wrapping around a wooden drill, a yun, with a stone or flattened iron nail tip wedged into the bottom. The upper drill end nestles into the stone socket of a wooden mouthpiece, and I'm sorry that's dark, but in the center left there you have the yun and the kikmiak, the mouthpiece. The kikmiak is gripped between the teeth and propelled by the bow. The length of the bow varies depending on the size of the walrus tusk, but also depending on the carver's arm length and then what he felt most comfortable with. As a tool, the drill bow can bore holes in surfaces, it can be used to start fires, and it can also be used to engrave on other drill bows. And this is a really neat aspect of the drill bow, that when a carver was using the bow, he would be looking down, looking at these engravings, and as he's moving the bow, the engravings are becoming alive, so to speak. They're becoming animated through motion. The majority of 19th century drill bows are engraved in a particular style, often featuring a single or double baseline at the top and or bottom of the bow upon which the carver aligned his engravings. Carvers around Seward Peninsula, including Little Diomede, King Island, and Wales, tended to construct their human figures with really small, round drilled heads, which you can see there at the top. And the bodies are often made of vertical and horizontal lines. So if you think of a stick figure, that is often what their engravings look like. The animals, boats, and village motifs are typically outlined with a channel of deep engraving and then filled in by gouging out the center or using shallow vertical lines. So you often see it gouged out and then filled, or really small lines. Motifs are often small and crowded upon the surface upon which you can see, and sometimes the carver would flip the bow around and engrave a completely new scene on the same side. So in effect, when you're looking at it, it looks upside down. Carvers from Kotzebue Sound and more northern parts of Alaska, including Point Hope and Barrow, often engraved less complex scenes with larger motifs. figures are quite large in comparison to the other motifs on there, and then animals and then people as well are often depicted with feet, something you don't see in the more southern style. After the carver engraved the scenes into ivory, they rubbed a mixture or variety of materials into the engravings to make them stand out. During the late 19th century, John Murdoch describes this addition of dark color from soot or red ochre, while Nelson described the engraving's black fill as a mixture of gunpowder and blood. Some of the carvers from King Island who I've worked with, in the early 1920s, carvers were using soot or ash from cigarettes to rub into the engravings. For later bows, primarily those after the 1890s, carvers often utilized graphite or black India ink. Some of the earliest collected bows depict rows of animals, including caribou, whale flukes, and fur skins stretched across the entire length. For instance, in this three-sided bow acquired by Captain Minor W. Bruce in Port Clarence, 3 sides are shown, which include engraved fox, whales, and fur skins. These rows of animals have often been interpreted as like tallies from the hunting season, as noted by John Murdoch, who wrote from here in Barrow in 1892. Murdoch said that, quote, "The only thing we saw of the nature of numerical records were the series of animals engraved on ivory." However, Murdoch goes on to say that in most cases we were unable to learn whether or not the figures really represented an actual record or not. Being unable to speak Inupiaq, it would have been difficult for him to ascertain if, exactly what was going on in the bows. So we say textual ambiguities such as these reveal the value of combining material culture analysis with oral traditions. Out of all the 19th century collectors of drill bows, perhaps none match the zeal of Edward W. Nelson, who you see here on the right. From 1877 to 1881, Nelson managed to acquire large collections of material culture from numerous communities in the Bering Strait, the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta, and the Lower Yukon. Thick with family histories and countless tales, Nelson could have scarcely understood this multimodal dynamic of drill bows during his whirlwind collecting trips. Rather than taking the time to record the engraved stories, Nelson appears to be focused more on acquiring bows or objects for their aesthetic appeal. He wrote in his journal on August 20th, 1877, "During the day, a number of drill bows and various ivory carvings were brought me by the natives to trade, some of which were very good." End quote. As noted in Nelson's diary, a 19th century market for carved ivory and other Alaska native-made objects increased cross-cultural interactions between natives and foreigners. As seen on this particular drill bow collected by Nelson, the motifs depict an American whaling vessel outside of a camp with foreigners or Westerners, hands on hips, making kind of a powerful statement about assumed issues of colonial authority. Inupiaq elder William Hensley explains that the variegated dynamics of colonial power relations contributed to economic oppression and denigration of the language and cultural practices. Not always welcomed, foreign presence challenged tribal sovereignty and instigated spiritual and cultural conflicts. In their pursuit to assist northern communities, 2 individuals, Sheldon Jackson and Dr. Daniel Newman, acquired large collections of Inupiaq objects which remain today within Alaska museums. Perhaps none was more concerned with the spiritual and economic welfare of Alaska natives than Sheldon Jackson, who you see here on the left, missionary and general agent of education for Alaska during 1885 to 1902. Jackson believed that the survival of northern communities depended on the implantation of Western education and also the domestication of animal resources. To this end, Jackson traversed southwest Alaska and the Arctic coast, inspecting schools and working tirelessly to bring reindeer from Siberia over to Alaska. Interesting thing about Jackson is that he traveled farther north than many Smithsonian collectors and acquired large collections of material from Kotzebue Sound, Point Hope, and up here in Barrow as well. Here in Barrow, Jackson acquired this triangular drill bow up at the top with a seal hide strap and left end carved into a whale's fluke, which you can see there. The motifs depict umiaks pursuing whales, bow hunters shooting tutu, and figures dragging seals. As explained by Asachuk of Point Hope in a story called The Land Grows and Dies, Inupiaq peoples believe that proper behavior and respect towards animals ensures the recycling of their souls and a return to earth as game animals once again. At the bottom you have another large drill bow collected by Jackson from Kotzebue Sound. This is very interesting. The bow is maybe 2 feet, something like that, and it has a really long drill, and the size of the drill makes it seem likely that it was made mostly for trade or for sale, because it would be very uncomfortable to use that large of a drill. Interesting example. In addition to Nelson and Jackson's field collecting, various other northern agents were engaged in acquiring ivory objects, including school teachers, traders, revenue cutter service personnel, and government positions, including Dr. Daniel S. Newman. Newman moved to Nome in 1910, and over the next 10 years traveled throughout northwest Alaska, providing medical assistance to northern communities. During his travels, Newman acquired over 3,000 Yupik and Inupiaq objects from trade, purchase, and as a payment for medical services. The majority of Newman's collection was purchased by the Alaska Historical Library Museum and includes at least 4 ivory drill bows. And this is an early example of not only how objects were displayed, but also how they were grouped according to types of materials or their function. This is a drill bow that was acquired by Newman. It appears to be made by a King Island carver. And like the previous one, a couple slides before, this one is interesting in that it combines an older pictorial style featuring figures with drilled heads, which you see on the right there, kind of these smaller motifs, with a new pictorial style, which is on the left, featuring large figures and animals with thick bodies, so you can see that they have some weight or depth to them, and they're engraved or filled in with a rocker fill. And rocker fill is a type of technique which King Island carvers became well known for in the 1920s, which essentially is taking a tool and rocking it back across the surface. So you see almost like a zigzag type line. Kind of in this regard, this pairing of new and old styles, this type of bow can be seen as a transitional object, moving from carvers creating objects that they would use themselves within their homes to objects made for sale. Following the discovery of gold in the late 19th century, demand for tourist items flourished, and carvers produced a range of objects, including letter openers, napkin rings, pole tusks, and cribbage boards. And you see here an example of a large number of cribbage boards that are now at the Carrie McLean Museum in Nome. This is Peter Mayak, the King Island carver. Although Dremels and Fordhams are now widely used, a few ivory carvers continue to make and use drill bows. As seen on this ivory drill bow from the 1930s, made from a carver in Little Diomede. The motifs are interesting, is that they're often found on ivory story bracelets, and you might have seen some of those around. Carvers from Little Diomede and Shishmaref often use this type of engraving. Contemporary individuals may also incorporate drill bows into their own toolkits, such as Inupiaq elder and Tigiak carver Henry Canuck, who's on the bottom right, and also Stevie Amatuk, who mentioned that Stevie Amatuk is from Point Hope, and he also mentions that he uses his grandfather's drill bow. Other artists such as Joe Canuck from King Island and Charlotte Asigak from Barrow also vividly recall their fathers creating and using drill bows. Just to close or to wrap up, within Inupiaq stories, or communities, oral stories related to ivory carvings remain essential tools to pass on family histories, cultural values, and subsistence techniques. Contemporary ivory carvers draw on oral narratives for visual expression, as noted by Henry Canuck, who shared that, as an artist and carver, all my carvings come from hunting experiences, whaling experiences, stories told by my relatives, and sometimes from dreams. An integration of oral tradition into material cultural analysis will offer new insights and kind of the multiplicity of narratives behind the engravings, their roles within Arctic societies, and the ability for stories to re-engage communities with objects of cultural patrimony. This spring I have the really great privilege of working with additional carvers and communities in North Alaska with recent contributions from Barrow artists, including John Heffel, William Simmons, Lena Pollock, and even Hobson down here at the bottom. And then there's one more slide. Up at the top we have Whitlam Adams, Perry Matumik, Earl Aiken, and then Guilford Mangwayak down at the bottom. Sorry, he was a little dark. So I just wanted to thank them for sharing all of their carving experiences and stories while I've been here. And then also I've spoken with many other carvers and community members who've shared stories from their past, and then also things that they have made and the value of those objects to them. So just thank you again for coming, and I wish you a wonderful evening. So Yanak, thanks.